Your father's pension was guaranteed for life. Here is the exact year yours wasn't. My father worked for the same company for 31 years. He started in 1951, the year I was born, and he retired in 1982. He never asked what the market was doing. He never moved money between funds. He never worried about whether he had contributed enough, or whether the number in some account had grown or shrunk or stayed the same. He knew exactly what he would receive every month from the day he retired until the day he died. The company had promised him a number. The number was in writing. It did not change. When he retired, that check arrived every month, the same amount, calculated on a formula that had been explained to him clearly on the day he was hired. A percentage of his final salary multiplied by his years of service. Simple mathematics, a commitment, a number he could build a life around. He died in 2009 at 83 years old. That check came every month for 27 years of retirement. He never ran out. He never worried. He had made a deal with his employer, and his employer kept the deal. I think about that deal now, and I think about what was happening in 1978, while my father was still working, while he still had 4 years to go before retirement, while the check he was counting on was still a guaranteed future rather than a delivered present. In 1978, Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1978. Buried inside that act, in a section of the Internal Revenue Code that almost nobody read at the time, was a small provision. It was not designed to change how Americans retire. It was not debated as a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between employer and employee. It was added to address a narrow question about how executives could defer compensation on bonuses and stock options. The people who wrote it were thinking about tax treatment for bank executives. They were not thinking about my father. They were not thinking about you. The provision was Section 401k. It sat there largely unnoticed for almost 2 years. Then a benefits consultant in Pennsylvania named Ted Benna read it on a Saturday afternoon in his office without the distraction of a ringing telephone. He saw something that everyone else had missed. He saw that this provision, interpreted in a particular way, could be used to create a retirement savings vehicle for any employee, not just executives. So he pitched the idea to a bank client. The bank's lawyers were nervous. They rejected it. So Benna used it at his own company instead. In 1981, the IRS clarified the rules in a way that allowed salary contributions, not just bonuses. The plans began to proliferate. By 1983, nearly half of all large firms offered or were considering offering a 401k plan. Ted Benna later called what he created a monster. His exact words in a 2011 interview were that the 401k had become too complex, that workers were not equipped to make the investment decisions being asked of them, and that he had helped open the door for Wall Street to make even more money than they were already making. The father of the 401k became its most prominent critic. But by the time he said those words, the transformation was already complete. Oh, the pension system that my father relied on, the system that had given him a guaranteed number every month for 27 years, had been largely replaced by a system in which workers were responsible for their own retirement security. Subject to the movements of markets they did not control, dependent on decisions they were often not equipped to make. The percentage of private sector workers with only a defined benefit pension plan was 60% in the early 1980s. Today, it is 4%. This is not a natural change. It did not happen because pensions stopped working. It happened because something changed through specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments. And once you understand what those decisions were and when they were made and what drove them, you cannot unsee what was taken, what a pension actually was. Before we go further, I want to make sure we are talking about the same thing, because the word pension has become vague, used to describe almost any retirement benefit, sometimes even used to describe a 401k itself. The thing my father had was something specific. It had a name that matters: defined benefit. A defined benefit pension is exactly what the name says. The benefit is defined. Before you retire, sometimes before you are even hired, the formula is established. Your benefit will be, for example, 2% of your final average salary for each year of service. 30 years of service at a final salary of $50,000 gives you $30,000 per year for life, regardless of what happens to the stock market, regardless of what happens to inflation, regardless of whether you live to 70 or 95. The risk sits with the employer. The employer promises a number. The employer must fund that promise through contributions to a pension fund. The employer must manage those investments well enough to meet the obligation. If the investments underperform, the employer makes up the difference. If the employer goes bankrupt, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, a federal insurance system created in 1974, backs up the promise up to a certain amount. The worker's job is to work. The employer's job is to keep the promise. This was how retirement worked in America for roughly a generation. In the decade following World War II, defined benefit pensions became the standard for private sector employment. By 1979, among medium and large private firms, 87% of full-time workers participated in a retirement plan, and most of those plans were defined benefit. The Bureau of Labor Statistics documented this in precise detail. This was not an accident of history. It was not a temporary arrangement that happened to exist and then naturally evolved into something else. It was a deliberate structure built through decades of collective bargaining, through federal legislation, through a social understanding that the relationship between an employer and a long-term employee included an obligation that extended beyond the last day of work. My father understood this. Your father, if he worked in manufacturing or utilities or telecommunications or any of the major industries of the post-war American economy, probably understood it too. It was the deal. The deal was real. And then, quietly, and without any single moment that announced itself as a turning point, the deal changed. The man who moved the risk. To understand how the deal changed, you need to understand what a 401k is and what it is not. A 401k is a defined contribution plan. The contribution is defined, not the benefit. You put in some amount each month. Your employer may match some portion of that amount. The money goes into an account in your name. You choose how to invest it among the options your employer provides. The account grows or shrinks depending on how those investments perform. When you retire, you have whatever is in that account. If the market is up the year you retire, you have more. If the market is down the year you retire, you have less. There is no guaranteed monthly amount. There is no formula based on years of service and final salary. There is a number in an account, and that number is yours, and it is the entirety of what the employer owes you. The risk moved. Under defined benefit, the employer bears the risk that the pension fund will not perform well enough to pay the promised benefit. Under defined contribution, the employee bears the risk that the market will not perform well enough to fund an adequate retirement. This is not a minor distinction. This is the entire substance of what changed. In 1978, when Congress passed the Revenue Act, almost no one understood that this was happening. The Section 401k provision was added without significant debate about its implications for the American retirement system. As the congressional record shows no extended discussion of what it might mean for the balance between employer obligation and employee risk. It was a tax provision. It was handled as a tax provision. What Benna saw in 1979 on that Saturday afternoon in his office was an opportunity. He was a benefits consultant. His job was to help companies manage their benefit costs. A 401k plan, he understood, was cheaper for employers than a defined benefit pension. The employer's obligation under a 401k is limited to whatever match it chooses to offer. The unpredictable, potentially very large obligation to fund an actuarially determined pension benefit disappears. When Benna began pitching 401k plans to companies in the early 1980s, he was not selling retirement security. He was selling cost savings. He was helping companies move the risk of retirement financing from their balance sheets to their employees' shoulders. The companies that adopted 401k plans were not doing something wrong. They were responding rationally to a new option that the tax code had made available. They were reducing their costs. They were managing their financial exposure. They were doing what corporations do. But the workers who accepted 401k plans in exchange for pensions, and in many cases who had no choice in the matter because their employer simply announced the change, were accepting something they did not fully understand. They were accepting responsibility for a set of decisions: investment allocation, contribution timing, market risk management that their employers had previously handled for them. They were becoming their own pension fund managers without the training, the resources, or the information that professional pension fund managers use to do the job. Most of them did not know it. Most of them were told that the 401k was just as good as the pension. Some of them were told it was better because the money was theirs, in an account with their name on it. The moment of the announcement, I want to stop here and talk about a specific moment that many Americans of a certain age remember, because it is a moment that happened in workplaces across the country in the 1980s and 1990s, and because the way that moment was handled tells you something important about what was actually happening. A company announces to its employees that it is changing its retirement benefit. The defined benefit pension is being replaced by, or supplemented by, or in some cases simply replaced by, a 401k plan. Human resources representatives explain the new plan. There is perhaps a presentation. There are papers to sign. This moment was framed as a good thing. Workers were told they would have more flexibility. They were told the money would be portable, meaning they could take it with them if they changed jobs. They were told they could control their own investments. They were told they were getting more, not less. What they were not told, because the people delivering the presentation may not have fully understood it themselves, was the fundamental nature of the transfer that was taking place. The employer was transferring the risk of retirement financing from itself to them. The guarantee was being removed. The promise was being replaced with an opportunity. Some workers who were close to retirement and had substantial pension benefits were protected by grandfather provisions. Others were not. Some fought through their unions and preserved pension benefits for existing employees while accepting 401k plans for new hires. Others had no union and no leverage. By the time most American workers understood what had happened, the transition was largely complete. Why companies made the change? I want to be fair about this because the story is more complicated than a simple account of corporate greed would suggest. Defined benefit pensions had become genuinely expensive and genuinely complicated to manage. ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, had imposed extensive funding requirements and reporting obligations on pension plans. Companies that had underfunded their pensions for years were suddenly required to make up the shortfall. The actuarial and administrative costs of running a defined benefit plan had grown substantially. The shift in the American economy away from large, long-tenure manufacturing employment and toward service industries, where workers changed jobs more frequently, also changed the calculus. Defined benefit pensions reward long tenure. A worker who stays 30 years builds substantial benefits. A worker who leaves after 5 years walks away with very little. As the economy shifted toward more mobile employment patterns, the pension's tenure incentive became less of an advantage for employers and more of a structural mismatch. These were real forces, and they would have put pressure on the defined benefit system regardless of whether Section 401k existed or not. But the availability of a tax-advantage alternative accelerated the transition in ways that likely would not have occurred on the same timeline without it. The 401k did not cause the decline of pensions. It provided the mechanism through which that decline happened quickly, broadly, and in many cases without the kind of negotiation or legislative process that a change of this magnitude would otherwise have required. Congress did not vote to end the American pension system. No president signed a bill abolishing guaranteed retirement security for private sector workers. No single decision was made that could be pointed to as the moment the deal changed. It changed because a provision in a tax act created an option, and a benefits consultant found a way to use that option, and corporations recognized that the option served their interests, and the transition happened company by company, workplace by workplace, across 2 decades, without any moment of public accounting for what was being decided. The people who benefited from the transition, the corporations that reduced their pension obligations, made specific choices. The people who were harmed by the transition had those choices made for them, often without their full understanding of what was changing, and often without any meaningful ability to object. What happened to the money? There is another part of this story that rarely gets discussed alongside the 401k transition. When companies moved from defined benefit pensions to defined contribution plans, what happened to the money that had accumulated in the pension funds? In many cases, when a company terminated an overfunded pension plan, the surplus assets reverted to the company. Before 1986, this was relatively unrestricted. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990 imposed an excise tax on pension asset reversions, which reduced but did not eliminate the practice. From the mid-1980s through the early 1990s, Billions of dollars in pension assets were transferred from pension funds to corporate treasuries through plan terminations. Workers whose pension plans were terminated received the benefits they had already accrued, protected up to certain limits by the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. The surplus, above what was needed to meet those accrued obligations, went to the company. Our workers who had spent years contributing to the value of those surplus assets through their labor and who would have continued to earn larger pension benefits under the original plan if they had stayed, received nothing from the surplus. The money their work had generated went to the institution rather than to the people. This is not a claim about intent. Corporate executives who terminated overfunded pension plans were acting legally within the rules that Congress had established. But the rules had been established in a way that allowed wealth generated partly by worker labor to be captured by corporate shareholders when the pension system was dismantled. The financial industry's role, the 401k system, created something that the defined benefit system had not. Tens of millions of Americans, each with an individual investment account that needed to be managed, and each therefore a potential customer for financial products and financial advice. Under a defined benefit system, the pension fund manager, a professional, makes investment decisions for the entire pool of pension assets. Individual workers have no investment accounts to manage and therefore need no financial advisors, no mutual funds to choose among, no brokerage accounts to open. The pension system, from the perspective of the financial services industry, was a large pool of capital managed by professionals with no consumer retail dimension. The 401k system is exactly the opposite. Every worker has an account. Every account needs to be allocated across investment options. Every allocation decision is an opportunity for a financial product to be sold. The financial services industry, over the decades since the 401k proliferated, has collected enormous fees from the management of 401k assets. Research published by the Council of Economic Advisors found that conflicted investment advice that benefits the advisor rather than the client, costs 401k savers approximately $17 billion per year in reduced returns. That is not a small number. It is $17 billion per year every year, taken from the retirement savings of American workers and transferred to financial intermediaries. This was not a possibility under the defined benefit system. The professional pension fund managers who managed pension assets operated under fiduciary standards that limited the fees they could charge and the conflicts of interest they could tolerate. The defined contribution system, by moving investment decisions to individual workers who lack the sophistication to evaluate financial products and whose advisors may be operating under conflicts of interest, created a system in which the transfer of wealth from savers to financial intermediaries is structurally embedded. Ted Benna said he had helped open the door for Wall Street to make even more money than they were already making. He was right. He said it with regret. What the numbers show, the consequences of the 401k transition are visible in the data in ways that should be deeply troubling for anyone paying attention. At the peak of the defined benefit system in the early 1980s, approximately 60% of private sector workers with any retirement plan had a defined benefit pension as their primary retirement vehicle. Today, that number is approximately 4%. More than half of American households are at risk of being unable to maintain their standard of living in retirement, according to research from the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College. This figure has barely changed despite decades of rising stock markets and decades of 401k plan expansion. The 401k system has been in place for over 40 years. If it were going to solve the retirement security problem for American workers, it would have done so by now. The median 401k balance for Americans approaching retirement age is approximately $185,000. If you withdraw 4% of that per year, which financial planners consider a sustainable withdrawal rate, you receive about $7,400 annually. Social Security adds more, but for many workers, the combination still falls substantially short of the income they had in their working years. My father's monthly check, adjusted for the formula of his plan, gave him a replacement rate of approximately 70% of his pre-retirement income. That is what financial planners consider adequate. Most 401k retirees will not achieve a 70% replacement rate from their own savings. They will rely more heavily on Social Security, and Social Security was designed as a supplement to pension income, not as a substitute for it. The promise that the 401k would serve the retirement needs of American workers as well as defined benefit pensions did not prove true. The system that replaced the pension transferred risk from institutions that could manage it to individuals who largely could not, reduced the total retirement income available to most workers, generated enormous profits for the financial services industry, and freed corporations from obligations they had voluntarily assumed and then decided they no longer wished to bear. The grandfather's watch. I have a watch that belonged to my grandfather. He received it from his company on the occasion of his retirement in 1961, after 35 years of service. The watch is gold. On the back, it is engraved with his name, the years of his service, and the words presented in appreciation. It still keeps time. A retirement gift like this had meaning in 1961 because it marked the conclusion of a complete transaction. My grandfather had given 35 years. His company had given him in exchange not just wages for 35 years, but a commitment that extended beyond those years into the decades of his retirement. The watch was a symbol of a relationship that was now fully documented and fully binding. The company would pay him every month for the rest of his life. He would not have to worry. He had done his part. They had done theirs. I wonder what the equivalent symbol would be for a worker retiring today from a company that converted their pension to a 401k 30 years ago. There is no watch. There is an account balance, subject to the movements of markets they did not control, representing the accumulated savings of a working lifetime, with no guarantee about how long it will last or whether it will be enough. The transaction that my grandfather completed in 1961 was a different transaction from the one available to most American workers today. It was more secure. It was more reliable. It was designed explicitly to provide retirement income for life rather than retirement savings for a period of uncertain length. That different transaction existed. It was not a fantasy or an idealization of a past that never happened. The Bureau of Labor Statistics documented it. The Department of Labor administered it. Tens of millions of Americans lived inside it, worked inside it, retired inside it, and then, Through a series of decisions made in corporate boardrooms and in Congress and in IRS regulatory proceedings, it was replaced. The ERISA question. I want to address something that makes this history complicated. Because any honest account has to deal with it. ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, was passed by Congress to protect workers' pension rights. Before ERISA, companies could and did promise pensions and then failed to fund them adequately. Workers who had spent careers expecting a pension sometimes found, on retirement, that the pension fund did not have enough money to pay what had been promised. There were spectacular failures, most notably the Studebaker Auto Company bankruptcy in 1963, which left 4,000 workers with reduced or eliminated pension benefits they had spent years earning. ERISA was meant to prevent this. It established minimum funding standards. It required vesting schedules that gave workers rights to their benefits after a certain period of service. It created the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation to ensure pension benefits against plan failures. These were genuine protections, and they represented a real improvement over what had existed before. But ERISA also made defined benefit pensions substantially more expensive to administer, and it imposed regulatory burdens that, over time, made some employers less willing to maintain their pension plans. Scholars who have studied the history argue that ERISA, intended to protect the defined benefit system, inadvertently contributed to its decline by making it too costly to sustain. The same Congress that created ERISA also, 4 years later, created the tax provision that would become the 401k. Whether this was intentional coordination or separate actions with unintended interactions is a question historians continue to debate. That what is not debatable is that the combination of ERISA's burdens on defined benefit plans and the 401k's tax advantages for defined contribution plans shifted the economic incentives for employers in a consistent direction, away from the pension and toward the 401k. The workers who bore the consequences of this shift did not vote for it. They did not negotiate it. In most cases, they did not even understand it was happening until the transition was complete. The people who kept the promise. There are still employers who offer defined benefit pensions. They are worth noting because their existence demonstrates that the system remains possible. Most state and local government employees still have defined benefit pensions. Federal employees have the Federal Employees Retirement System, which includes a defined benefit component. Some unionized industries, construction trades, certain manufacturing sectors have maintained pension plans through collective bargaining. The teachers who taught your children, the firefighters who protect your neighborhood, the police officers who work your streets. In most jurisdictions, they still retire with defined benefit pensions. The government kept the promise for its own workers. In ways, it did not require private employers to keep for theirs. The difference in retirement security between public sector workers and private sector workers in America is now significant and growing. A retired public school teacher knows what her monthly check will be. A retired private sector worker with a 401k knows only what her account balance is today and cannot know with certainty what it will be when she needs it. This difference was created by specific policy choices. It did not arise from any natural principle about what is possible or affordable. The defined benefit pension works when it is properly funded and properly managed. Governments have demonstrated this by continuing to provide it to their own employees. The decision to replace it in the private sector with a defined contribution system was a choice, and the consequences of that choice have fallen on the workers who had the least power to resist it. The questions that do not go away. My father worked for 31 years and received a check every month for 27 years of retirement. He never worried about the market. He never moved his money between funds. He never feared outliving his savings. I have colleagues who worked for 30 years and watched their 401k accounts lose a third of their value in the crash of 2008. Some of them delayed retirement. Some of them did not. Some of them are working through their 70s because the account they were counting on is smaller than they expected. The fundamental difference between my father's retirement and theirs is not about how hard they worked or how wisely they saved. It is about which transaction was available to them when they entered the workforce, and whether that transaction was honored or changed. Section 401k of the Revenue Act of 1978 was not debated as a fundamental restructuring of American retirement security. It was a tax provision addressing the treatment of deferred compensation. The people who wrote it were not thinking about what American retirement would look like 40 years later. Ted Benner, who found the provision and figured out how to use it, later called it a monster. He called it a monster not because of what he intended, but because of what it became, the primary retirement vehicle for most American workers. A vehicle he considered poorly designed for that purpose, too complex, too vulnerable to financial industry exploitation, too dependent on investment decisions that workers were not equipped to make. The father of the 401k became its most prominent critic. He said he would blow up the existing structure and start over if he could. He is still alive, still working as a retirement consultant in Pennsylvania, still arguing for reforms to a system that his interpretation of a tax provision helped create. The defined benefit pension that was the standard for American private sector retirement in 1979 is now a rarity. The people who had it are, like my father, in their 80s and 90s, if they are alive at all. Their children, who entered the workforce in the 1980s and 1990s, are now approaching retirement age with 401k accounts instead of pension promises. The watch my grandfather received is still keeping time. The pension it represented has been replaced. The promise it symbolized, the promise of a complete transaction between an employer and a long-service employee, has become unusual enough that most young Americans have never experienced it, and many are not sure it ever existed. It existed. The Bureau of Labor Statistics documented it. The Department of Labor administered it. Tens of millions of Americans lived their retirements inside it. And then, without a vote on the fundamental question, without a national debate about whether the deal should change, without any moment at which the country as a whole decided that workers should bear the full risk of their own retirement financing, it was replaced. One provision in a tax act that nobody was watching. I have only questions I cannot fully answer. Whether the defined benefit pension could have survived the economic changes of the 1980s and 1990s without the 401k as an alternative. Whether the employers who terminated their pension plans did so because they had to or because they could. As whether the workers who accepted 401 COSE plans in exchange for pensions would have accepted the exchange if they had understood what they were accepting. I do not know. But the questions do not go away. My father's check arrived every month for 27 years. The desk in his study, where he balanced his accounts against that predictable number, is still there. The promise that produced the check is mostly gone. And once you understand what replaced it, and when, and how, and whose interests were served by the replacement, you will find that the questions it raises do not go away either.